Hi, everyone. This is Andy Erickson, Napa Valley winemaker, vintner, and also a proud member of the board of Napa Valley Vintners, which is an organization that represents 550 member wineries in Napa Valley. And welcome to our latest edition of Napa Valley Sessions, which is here to support our online library auction, which we are partnering with Zacky's on. Our host today, Antonio Galloni, good friend of the Valley and owner of Vinous, which for me is probably the richest, deepest site for wine content. I mean, I love the site. There's so many videos and interviews, and you can look up any place around the world and learn about the wines. I love it. Antonio, you want to take it away?
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Andy, for that very warm introduction and welcome. It's an absolute delight to be with you this afternoon. I guess it's a little earlier in California than it is in New York, but wonderful to be with you. We have a fantastic seminar this afternoon. We're going to look at wines beyond Cabernet Sauvignon. I think that obviously so much of what goes on with the Valley is related to Cabernet, but a lot of the origins, a lot of the history is tied to actually other grapes. Some of that may change as we talk about climate change and other things that are driving current trends. So Napa Valley is much more than just Cabernet, and we're going to get into that in a second. As Andy, as you said, this is the fifth of the Napa Valley sessions. So we've had 4 seminars this week and last week. Those seminars are available for replay for anyone who missed it. So I'd encourage you to check those out because we've had some incredible discussions. We've taken a deep dive at Oakville. Rutherford was a very rich seminar on history. We had the first seminar which featured 3 young emerging winemakers. Yesterday we looked at the Down Valley, so cooler climate areas of the valley. So we talked about Coombsville and we talked about Stag's Leap. And as I mentioned earlier today, we're going to look at varieties beyond Cabernet Sauvignon. So I'm going to introduce our 4 panelists. There's an open Q&A, so I'd encourage you to ask questions. It's a panel with an extraordinary amount of experience. And so I'd urge you to take advantage of that. And so I'm going to introduce the panelists and we'll hear from each of them. We'll talk about some of the wines in the auction and take your questions. So it's going to be really fun. I'd like to welcome Tim Calla to our panel. Tim fell in love with less mainstream wine while working the harvest in Mendoza, Argentina. He started at Sainsbury in 2010, where he discovered his passion for Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, which are very enigmatic varieties. We'll talk about that as we go through the wines and through the panel. Jennifer Williams, she worked alongside Rosemary Cakebread, Francoise Pechon, and a number of luminaries in the wine industry. She's studied in Paso Robles, Napa, Rioja, and Spain before starting at Arrow&Branch, but she also makes wines for a bunch of other projects, which I'm fortunate to taste each and every year. So her expertise goes well beyond the wines that we're going to talk about this afternoon. And she's particularly fascinated with Cabernet Franc, which is an incredible topic, not just for Napa Valley, but in the world. There's just such an interest in Franc these days. So there's a lot to talk about there. Then I'd like to also then welcome Bob Yali. Bob makes a number of fantastic wines, especially around Zinfandel from some of the top vineyards, not just in Napa Valley, but in Sonoma. I've been really lucky to taste these wines over the years. And these are wonderful expressions of sight in a variety that is sometimes a little bit overlooked, but Zinfandel is planted quite a bit in Napa Valley and it's planted even more so extensively in Sonoma. And so that's, it's a grape that can be very expressive of place. So welcome, Bob. Thanks for joining. And last but certainly not least, Geneviève Janssens from Robert Mondavi. I've had the pleasure of tasting with her for, I don't know, many years. She's got a national diploma of enology from the University of Bordeaux. I was the former director of production at Opus One before becoming the chief winemaker at Robert Mondavi Winery, where she's spent more than 20 years. So when it comes to sort of an idea of how the Valley has changed over the last several decades, Genevieve has a really unique perspective. So welcome, Genevieve. So I think we've got everybody here. So this is going to be fun. We're just going to jump right in. I want to start with you, Tim, because Saintsbury is a winery that's very near and dear to my heart. It was the first winery that I visited in Napa Valley. It was a college. It was a sort of a weekend getaway. One of my friends from business school and I, we took off for a weekend. We went to Napa Valley. It was not like Sideways. It was very PG rated, but it was a guys. And we went to Napa Valley and visited a lot of places and had a great deal of fun. But the very first place that we went to is Saintsbury, which is in Carneros, an appellation that is shared between Sonoma and Napa Valley. But when people think about Napa Valley, if they're not thinking about Cabernet, they may be thinking about Petit Syrah or Zinfandel or Sauvignon Blanc, but Pinot Noir isn't the first thing that comes to mind. So tell us a little bit about Carneros and what makes it unique, what makes it so well suited for these varieties you love, the Burgundian varieties of Pinot Noir and Chardonnay.
Of course. Thanks for having me. Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, I think they're two grapes that often go hand in hand. I know that when Dick and Dave founded Saintsbury in the early 80s, they were exploring the potential of these two grapes in a part of the Napa Valley that was inherently cooler than the rest of the valley. I think that the morning fogs that we always see from the influence of the bay, as well as the afternoon winds, were the driving climatic indicator that Pinot Noir and Chardonnay could work well. And the pretty interesting soil series, not just in and around our winery itself, but all over the Carneros region, provided a lot of opportunity to explore the potential of these two grapes. So I really think that the inherent diversity of the soils available, as well as the climate that we often found in the microclimate that we often found in Carneros, was really the driving force for Dick and Dave's pioneering exploration of these two grapes in Carneros.
Yeah, and so for folks who don't know, we're at the very south of Napa Valley, and it is a very uniquely cool microclimate that is quite different from what you might find in Cabernet land. You make a number of wines. Tell us about. Let's see if I can get this in the. I want to see if I can get this in the picture because it's a magnum, and I've been tasting wine all day. But I never get tired. Yeah, you have one too. I never get tired. People say, "Don't you get tired?"
I would too.
Yeah. People say, "Don't you get tired?" And I know the wines are great when I don't get tired. Like at the end of the day, if it's a tough vintage somewhere, like somewhere in the world, then I'm tired. But if it's a great vintage, I'm never tired. It doesn't matter how many wines or how many appointments or anything. So we're tasting this wine. You picked a really interesting vintage, which is 11, which is a vintage that most people would like to forget. But we've been talking about this throughout these series, that a lot of times these vintages that are maybe not so showy at the beginning, or that have some challenges, when you taste the wines after a number of years, you're often pleasantly surprised. And sometimes you might even be more surprised than you are with the evolution of more storied vintages that are where the expectation is so high, and the wines can't always live up to those expectations. But this wine is absolutely beautiful. It's 10 years old. It's in its prime drinking window, maybe even a little young. Tell us about Brown Ranch and this vintage. Would have been your second year there, right?
Sure, it's my second year. The first year sort of went in a flash. I started in early August. We had a big heat spike by Labor Day, and I almost forget the 2010 vintage. But 2011 was the whole thing from bud break through harvest, and it was my first year living down in Carneros, and I just remember the morning fog, waking up to being just completely locked in by fog. And then as the growing season continued, I remember the arrival of rains at times where people weren't quite comfortable. And then, by late September, we started picking the fruit from Brown Ranch. And Brown Ranch is a ranch that Dick and Dave planted in the early 90s, and to Dijon and Pommard clones. And it's really been our research as to the possibilities of Pinot Noir and Carneros. And I just remember how adamantly the vintage stamp on wines we made. And Jerome Sherry was the winemaker. Chris Galloni was his associate winemaker, our associate winemaker, and I was the junior most person on the winemaking team. And to me, it was a definitive vintage.
The wine is showing absolutely beautifully. It's still fresh. It has very slight elements of what you would expect to see in a wine of this age, you know, sort of tobacco, cedary notes, but there's a lot of fruit, and especially the Magnum, that wine is just beautiful. So I'm only going to say I'm not surprised, because I have the privilege of tasting so many wines every year in Napa Valley, and I've had a chance to taste a lot of 11. So I'm not at all surprised that this wine is so beautiful. But for folks who may have looked past this vintage at the beginning, this is a beautiful wine for drinking now. So it's a Magnum. So wonderful. Magnum always helps. Cool. Well, thank you, Tim. I know you're in Uruguay, so I think it was a great move. We're going to hand it over to Jen Williams to talk about Arrow&Branch, which I know you're super passionate about these wines. And I've been lucky to taste them pretty much since the beginning, but not this vintage. So this one's a new one for me. But I know you have a really strong interest for Cabernet Franc. So tell us what it is about this variety that you find so enticing and so alluring.
Sure. I mean, Cabernet Franc. So yeah, the wine that you're tasting, Antonio, is the 2013 Arrow&Branch red wine. And so it's a blend of Cabernet Franc is the dominant blender there. I think it's about 60%. And then there's a splash of Merlot and Cab Sauv and Petit Verdot. And what I absolutely love about Cabernet Franc is the diversity that it provides. So this Cabernet Franc is about 30 years old. It was planted in 1990, and it's planted in Coombsville, and Coombsville enjoys the bay breezes from the San Pablo Bay, so this marine influence. And for Cabernet Franc tends to do really well in cool areas, but it's also a tough grape, so it can do well in warmer areas as well. And in Coombsville, because we have those bay breezes, it really has the ability, Cabernet Franc has the ability to preserve its aromatic capacity. So one of the things I like about Cabernet Franc is the floral notes that it can provide. And then there's a wide range of fruits. So red fruits, blue fruits, up to blackberry. And in addition to many spice notes. So I think naturally as a grape, it's complex, it's interesting. From a growing perspective, I find it a little fickle, kind of like the Pinot Noir of the Bordeaux world. But it's, I think it often, when it's planted in when it's planted in the correct places, it really, really delivers. So I talked about that. The vineyard that we have is about 30 years old now, and which is, I think, about 40 years. It was planted about 40 years after the first Cabernet Franc was introduced into the Napa Valley. And as far as our records can show, Cabernet Franc was introduced in the late 40s in one of the Tokelon parcels by Martin Stelling. And he was replanting a lot of that property following world wars, prohibition, the Depression. And he looked at Bordeaux varieties for the replant. And so as far as I understand, he is responsible for introducing Cabernet Franc to our valley.
Yeah, it's really interesting that, obviously we can talk about this as we go, but obviously Cabernet Franc is a variety that is receiving a lot more attention. I think part of it is people are tasting wines like this and they're noticing that aromatic intensity, but also it's a vintage, especially it's a variety, for example, in Bordeaux, as you know, that a lot of people are replanting on the right bank in place of Merlot when you're places like Saint-Emilion, and this is in response to climate change. But if you have to replant some Merlot, there might be a little bit more Franc going into a lot of these historic vineyards than in the past. But you make wines from Franc, not just in Coombsville, but in different parts of the area. So different parts of the valley. So how does it respond to in different places? I mean, we talked about Coombsville, but what about more up valley?
Sure. Yeah, I work with Franc in Yountville and then in Oakville as well, and a little bit on Atlas Peak. And I think that they all have a similar characteristic as far as the floral note that can be achieved. I find that the Francs that we deal with, farther up valley, North Valley, are I think they just come in, they just harvest a little bit earlier than the cooler regions, but they still have the same richness. I think whether you're in a cool region or in a warmer region, we are able to achieve a lovely richness and ripeness from Cabernet Franc, largely because I think Napa Valley is known for being incredible for sunshine. You know, whether you're in Coombsville or St. Helena or Calistoga. But one of the things that I think about Cabernet Franc is I always think that it's the party animal of the vineyard, because it's usually the earliest to the party as far as bud break goes. And then it's, as far as phenological ripening goes, it takes its time, because one of the characteristics of Franc is that it does have like a pyrazine, a greener character, an herbal character. And so if Cabernet Franc is planted into, marginal sites, or in a place where, I don't know, where the farming might not be up to par, then you are going to retain those green characters, and they might be offensive. I, for one, love a little bit of this classic herbal component. And so that's one of the reasons I love Cabernet Franc, is that it can preserve some of that classic herbal notes all the way through ripening, and really, really be a beautiful, complex wine.
Yeah. You think Cabernet Franc can carry a wine 100%, or does it have to be blended?
So for Arrow&Branch, actually, we've started to play with that. We have 3 different clones. We have clone 1, 214, and 327, and we have been bottling the Cab Francs by themselves. I think we can do it. I think it can do it by itself. Our flagship wine is this blend, which is a really beautiful wine. And the whole point of the blend is to see how we can accentuate the Cabernet Franc. But it's really exciting to see the different clones stand alone on their own. And I do think that they can stand alone. Yeah,
I mean, I've tasted some really good ones. Obviously, not too far from where you mentioned, the Dieterts have several. They make 2 Cabernet Francs. Yeah. This year, I tasted a lot of Beckstoffer Tokelon Cabernet Francs. So if Andy Beckstoffer's on, he's been on a bunch of these. So Andy, if you're watching, I tasted a bunch of your wines this year. Those were pure Beckstoffer Tokelon Cabernet Francs. Kathy Corison has one from Sunbasket in St. Helena. I think you buy fruit from Oakville Ranch, right? And Sleeping Lady and these. I do. From I get some Cabernet Franc also from the South Station and at the Oakville Station too. Yeah. So I mean, those are all like A+ places. So yeah. I mean, we could have it's one of my dreams to do one of these seminars that's Cabernet Francs from all over the world, and you could have like coastal Tuscany, Bordeaux, and Napa Valley, let's say, and the Loire too. But obviously in the Loire, you just naturally get sort of lighter wines. Not that that's bad, but I think that would be kind of stick out. But if you had coastal Tuscany, Bordeaux, and Napa Valley, you would get a really nice cross section of Franc. So that's kind of a dream that I have. Maybe we'll do that one day. I want to be part of that tasting. Your wine's showing beautifully, and thanks so much. I'm really glad because this is a vintage that it was before I started tasting this project, so it's new for me. So thanks. Great. That was awesome. Yeah, Franc is yeah. I mean, I love it personally. Let's talk Zinfandel with Bob Yali. Bob, I get to taste your wines not as often as I would like. I don't know why that is, but every time I taste them, they're just so impressive because obviously you're specialized in Zinfandel, even though you make other grapes, but the single vineyard focus. I mean, if I taste your Monterosso, it really tastes like Monterosso. Here in Napa, we're tasting Aldo's vineyard, which is in Oak Knoll. Tell us about Zinfandel and why is it your passion? Yeah, thanks, Antonio. I mean, I think that passion really came from my dad. He loved Zinfandel. Aldo's my dad. He's passed, but
he was one of the fellows that went through that conversion of Napa Valley. That up until 1970, Napa was widely planted with those two heritage varieties, the Zinfandel and Petit Syrah. As a matter of fact, they were the two most widely planted varieties. And then, of course, the judgment of Paris changed all that, and for lots of good reasons, and put Napa back on the map, and everyone's making a living, thank God. Um, but our mission is to retain these heritage varieties that were really once the massive part of Napa. I mean, it was what Napa was, and my family decided to kind of stick with those varieties, and now as it's turned out, they're pretty rare. It's only 2% of Napa, Zinfandel is, and so to have something very old in Napa is pretty fortunate. We're in the southern end of Napa. We're talking about cool climates here. We're in the Oaknell district, which is not as cool as Carneros, of course, but it's of course much cooler than Mid Valley and Up Valley. And it turns out that the first Zin was planted in our district, as it turns out, in 1854, right on the west side of the Oaknell district. And maybe they knew something then. Of course, as it moves up valley, it becomes a little richer, a little riper, which we contract those grapes as well, and we love them. But here in our district, it retains this freshness. This vineyard, the Aldos, named after my dad, was planted in 1837. It's surrounded right in the middle of town right now. I mean, when I grew up, it was in the middle of nowhere, but it is now on Jefferson Street, and it's a little green oasis for those living around it, and they I think they appreciate that little green park around them. I know all of us here, we know some of these interesting things about old vines, but maybe some others don't. A few years ago, I mapped the vineyard. One of the interesting things about old vineyards is that they don't come singularly planted to Zinfandel or any other variety. They are what we call these days a field blend. And in Aldos, we have 9 different varieties planted. And a few years ago, I walked it. It took me three days. It was a little bit of a project. And every square represents a vine. And this is a 6.02 acre vineyard. Every square represents a vine. Every color is a varietal. The purple is Zin. All the others are other varieties. The oddball, the most widely planted variety other than Zin in here is something called Aburio. It would have been planted in southern France, and it was really never meant to be like a star player in a vineyard here. It was always meant to be a friend, like just fill in the gaps and whatnot. We did make it on its own once just to see what we're dealing with, because it is a fairly large component in the vineyard. And it turns out it's very, very dark, thick skin, but kind of a medium tannin, low pH, and high pH, low acid. And that little nuance, that little thing right there in our district turns out to be a pretty wise thing to have done, because we do have an abundance of acid in our district. And so to have a variety that's kind of sprinkled in there to take that little bit of an edge off, so just polish that edge. It's like, oh, all right, that's a pretty good idea to have that in the vineyard. And so I just think there's great wisdom in how the farming culture at that time was done. And of course, these days it's not like that. These days modern farming is all about control and whatnot, and winemakers are in control. But there is some real cool spirit when the farmer kind of thinks, I know what really will do well in my district and on my land. And so I really appreciate that. One interesting little fun fact about this vineyard, when my grandmother, she was a widow early on, and she came from Italy and all of that, of course. And she became alone fairly early on in life with a little boy, my dad. And this vineyard, she traded, just hands down traded across the board for a 15-acre prune orchard across the creek. She was coveting this vineyard for a long time, and a developer came along and said, Christina, I want to buy your prune orchard over there. You know, it turns out to be Bel Air right now. And she goes, well, you know, I'm happy to do something, but I really don't want to sell it to you. I want that vineyard over there across the creek. And I mean, it was just a total swap. And my grandmother was just one of those interesting, hard-won women. I mean, very brilliant, very hardworking, and just kind of stuck to her guns. And you know, we still have it today, and it's still the same vineyard. So we're pretty proud of that. And Aldo's has this interesting characteristic always. It has you know, year in and year out, it has this like Asian spice thing kind of going on. Most years, kind of a Bing cherry component, pie crust Bing cherry. In the 18, it's more of a raspberry. So the pie is kind of filled with raspberries instead of Bing cherries. And it's really delicious. And I grew up with it, so I'm kind of partial to these flavors. So, I mean, everyone loves a good, strong Monte Rosso and all the others. We make 15 different Zinfandels. I mean, we take this variety seriously. I mean, we're really, really proud of this category. We love the grape, and I think it still has a strong place in Napa Valley, and we're really proud to, you know, kind of. We're not the only ones, obviously. There's lots of tremendous producers in Napa that are championing this variety. We do specialize in it, but it's really great to know that there are so many other wineries that have it in their lineup. So there you go. That's kind of who we are and why we do it. So.
Well, that's a great summary. You know, you touched on a lot of things that could make a great seminar just in themselves. The first is the idea of the field blend, which these are vineyards planted by Italian and German immigrants. Right. They intrinsically knew that you would get more diversity by interplanting different grapes, and that they wouldn't all ripen at the same time. So some grapes might be a little bit underripe, quote unquote. Some might be a little more ripe, and that the ensemble of those grapes would produce a complete wine. And you know, there's still, I think, from a consumer standpoint, these wines give you the opportunity to taste a wine with an enormous amount of history that a lot of modern Napa Cabernets just can't offer, because so much of the valley is much younger viticulturally. But you know, there's these fabulous vineyards in Napa Valley, like Oakville Farmhouse or the Library Vineyard in St. Helena, or St. Helena, obviously your vineyards, but where you can taste these wines that have a viticultural pedigree. It's sort of like drinking history. You're drinking wines not from 1 or 2 generations ago, but from many generations ago. And so I think from a consumer standpoint, they're a great opportunity, not just because of that historical facet, which is, I think, important and fascinating, but also they're much more affordable too than.
As it turns out, right. Turns out to be a bargain in Napa Valley.
Yeah, so.
And it is Napa, so they aren't quite inexpensive, but you know, you know, these are, I think they're coveted little spots, and I think they're worth every dime. So anyway.
So, I mean, yeah, so there's a lot to explore in Napa Valley outside of Cabernet, you know, whether it's Zinfandel, you mentioned Petit Syrah, which is still not heavily, but you can still find it in Calistoga. You know, you can still find it in Howell Mountain and some spots, also Zinfandel. So there's a lot of pockets of really interesting red varieties outside of Cabernet. So thank you, Bob. It was fascinating.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
I could spend hours asking you questions, but I won't do that to you this afternoon, maybe another time. But before we move to Q&A, I want to bring on Geneviève to talk about Sauvignon Blanc in Napa Valley. And I wanted to have your wine last, Geneviève, because you know, it's interesting. A lot of times people ask me, well, how do you decant red wines? And how, you know, I want to decant my red wine 6 hours in advance and all this other stuff. And I generally think that's a waste of time. But I'll tell you what, as I've gotten older, I've gained a greater appreciation for white wine. I'm much more likely to decant a white wine than a red wine, especially Riesling or Chardonnay or Sauvignon Blanc. And so often white wines are sort of the sort of what you drink before you get to like the real wine, you know? And of course, you know, when you go to Burgundy, for example, you always taste the red wines first and the white wines after, if a producer makes both. And so a lot of times I think it's fun to end with the white wine. So I wanted to put your wine last. I hope you don't mind. But we have from our Mondavi winery, the Tokalan Fumé Blanc, you call it Fumé Blanc. Robert Mondavi was the person who I believe coined that term. But tell us about your wine and what makes it so distinctive. You can already have. I may have had a glass already. It's you know it's educational.
It's a very refreshing wine, and that's my favorite variety because it's the first one for us to harvest. So it's going to put everybody, the team together in a very fast pace because harvest for Sauvignon Blanc is just a window of 10 days. So usually our flavors, and we are very focused to define, is not on the greener side and not on the more orange side like a mango or a more tropical orange fruit. But this is all in the white zone of the fruit. We are walking along the vineyard, and as soon as we feel that this is ready to pick, we are picking it. And of course, we pick the grapes at cold morning. We try to be extremely protective of the oxidation. We crush with dry ice. And that's why I think for the entire fermentation, it's in barrels, it's very slow, it's very cold. It's absolutely a beautiful wine to ferment. And it brings the terroir and the people all together at the beginning of the season. So it's usually in August. And the reason why I think you are great to mention that it needs to be decanted is because we protected so much from the oxidation, because you kill everything from the Sauvignon Blanc if it is oxidized. So it's a lovely wine to make, and of course, and it brings joy right away. That's something that winemakers love. The first moment of harvest every year is absolutely unique, and this is always celebrating our Sauvignon Blanc, and it reminds us Mr. Mondavi and his joy of promoting the Napa Valley, promoting his wine. The Fumé Blanc has been invented by him, but what is lovely too, because this vineyard is coming from Tokalan, he put Tokalan on his bottle a long time before we were putting Tokalan on Cabernet Sauvignon. So the Fumé Blanc Reserve Tokalan was had this appellation in 1986, so a long time ago. And he has this vision, and the terroir of Tokalan was absolutely gorgeous. So in this wine, we have I Block, which has been planted in 1945, T Block, which has been planted in 1955. And again, this is from the Sterling Vineyard. And this is old soul, old vines, which will make extremely complex wine. And there is a depth in old vines, which you cannot find in the young vineyard. So I like to compare age of vineyard like people. When you have a young 20 years, 30 years old person full of energy, is very inspiring. But then when you see a person a little bit more mature and a little bit more slow and with less vivacity in the discussion, there's a soul that you cannot find anywhere else than in an old vineyard. So that wine is made of 1945, 1955, and all 1989. So we have a touch of Semillon, 5%. And usually we have all of that in our Tokalan vineyard located in Oakville, in the west side of the Oakville appellation. The Semillon will bring a sort of very good texture and the weight, and will help to age the wine. Our wines can be aged for many decades and still enjoyable. That's why we have put a 1995 Fumé Blanc Reserve in our lots, because the person who will have the pleasure to have this wine will enjoy it, will be absolutely astonished by the quality of our Fumé Blanc Reserve. So I think it's the Sauvignon Blanc or the Fumé Blanc is so fragrant. You have a lot of beautiful nose, beautiful mouthfeel. It's a very evocative. You have verbena, you have sage, you have Mayo lemon, and you have a lot of salinity in the wine. So very complex wine and so enjoyable.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. What was the first Sauvignon Blanc planted in Napa Valley?
I think it was in Tocano in 1866 or 68 with J.W. Crabb, who was experimenting on the varieties. Yeah, it's a long time ago. And Tocano was one of the first vineyard planted with Sauvignon Blanc. Yeah. But Mr. Mondavi continued the legacy of the beautiful terroir of Tocano. And if you want a beautiful Sauvignon Blanc, you have to take the best place of the Cabernet Sauvignon, because that's where the Sauvignon Blanc is show the best fruit. So Sauvignon Blanc is a very rich variety, very vigorous. So if you put it in a deep soil with a lot of food in the soil, it's getting totally crazy. And instead of focusing on the fruit, it's focused on the vine, on the growth of the vines. So our vineyard are planted on a very well-drained, rocky soil in Tocano, and where the best Cabernet Sauvignon is growing just side by side. So it's a beautiful expression of the terroir in Tocano.
Well, the wine is showing beautifully. It's 2017 vintage, and obviously,
cheers.
That was not the easiest vintage. And this wine is, you know, I mean, if you gave it to me blind, there's no way I would say it's a wine from that vintage with those sorts of challenges. Even though it's obviously an early harvest of grapes, it didn't have a lot of the challenges of Cabernet Sauvignon, but the wine is showing beautifully. So that's wonderful. That's a great introduction to your wine. And I thought it'd be fun we've got a bunch of questions here, and I'm just going to throw them out to our panelists because I think this is just a wonderful set of questions. So I'm going to start with you, Jen, about the explosion of interest in Cabernet Franc. How much of that do you think is driven by
I think we lost him. I think the question was about Cabernet Franc and how much there's a greater interest in Cabernet Franc wines and grapes these days. A lot of what I think is driving that is a lot of the best ground was being given to Cabernet Sauvignon. And we're seeing that when the Cabernet Franc is put onto just as good of ground, then we have really compelling wines that are competitive with any Cabernet Sauvignon. So I think that's a big part of where there's a growth in Cabernet Franc. It's because of vineyard selection. I think that one of the things that Antonio and I spoke about earlier was also about the possibility of climate change playing into the role of Cabernet Franc growing in popularity. And because it does have, it is kind of a tough grape and can accept a later, kind of an average to later ripening profile, it is a possibility that could be playing into it as well.
Fabulous answer. I don't know what you said.
Welcome back.
But I'm sure it was great. Wonderful. Well, you got to have some hiccups. I mean, if there's no hiccups in technology, it's just not quite the same thing. You know, what is it? What do they say? Everything that can go wrong will go wrong eventually. So over 5 of these, we're going to have just about everything happen. All right, cool. I'm curious, Tim. Obviously, you focus on Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, but Carneros is also interesting for Merlot, for Syrah, for other varieties. Are there any thoughts to work with other grapes, or do you want to just stay focused on Pinot and Chard?
It's a great question. I try to get my hands on as many grape varieties as I can. In 2019, we worked with Saint Laurent for the first time, which Dale Ricci has planted on the Sonoma side of Carneros. And it's really compelling. It was a gift from the grower, and it was something that we bottled maybe 50 cases of and shared with our wine club. And, you know, Saint Laurent is a very popular grape in Eastern Europe. It's something that I probably didn't know about 5 years ago. And its parents are Pinot Noir and some sort of at this point, debated father. And to me, it has Pinot Noir characteristics, but it also has more suppleness, and on a warmer vintage, seemingly more elegance at lower alcohol. So it was really fun to explore. It is really fun to explore the potential of other grapes in Carneros. And yeah, we're constantly exploring those.
Cool. And obviously, every year there's so much to taste, and I've seen some really beautiful wines from other varieties, obviously, than what historically people tend to associate with Carneros. So it'll be interesting to see what you come up with. There's a question for Bob about other Italian varieties, Sangiovese, Barbera, that you work with. How do you compare and contrast those varieties with Zinfandel in the Napa Valley?
Well, we do make a little bit of Sangiovese from the home ranch there on El Centro, and it is a fruitier version than what one would find in Tuscany. I think that's in general probably a truth for most California wines when we try to do something from these varieties. But it still has a very characteristic Sangiovese-like character. And the same thing with the Barbera. The Barbera is actually, from what we understand, is the oldest Barbera vineyard in the valley. It's a tiny little only a quarter acre now. Used to be much larger, but that's what remains of it. And from our experience in tasting Barbera, you know, from my mother's from Alba, near Alba, and so we taste a lot of that. Of course, again, it's a little fruitier, but I tell you, it has the strength of acidity, these gentle tannins, lingering finish. I mean, it's really, really lovely. And how does it differ from Zinfandel? Well, Zinfandel is a completely different, you know, variety in itself. You know, one of the beauties of Zinfandel is its freshness, and I think most people will identify Zin with drinking it early on, between 3 and 5 years and whatnot, to retain that just vibrant, fresh fruit, which is a real beautiful quality in the variety. But I honestly prefer, at least, and from the wines that we make, I think ours aren't really over the top. They're fairly balanced, and I actually like to have. I prefer ours with, you know, closer to like 8 to 10 years on it, to tell you the truth. And because there's such vibrant acidity in all of our wines, you know, we really don't acidulate. We really try to allow the vineyard to speak for itself. And so I think that really adds to the longevity, the natural longevity to the wine. And so Zin is a much different character than Sangiovese and Barbera, without a doubt. I mean, it's just vibrant fruit. But it's also very complex because of the nature of how old these vineyards are, and the other varieties that are kind of going on in there. You know, I think they're complete wines. So that's kind of a little take on that.
That's cool. Geneviève, I want to put up this map of Tocolan that we did. That crashed my computer, but hopefully it's going to work now. And we can see exactly where this is from the back of our Oakville map. It's a comparison of, you can just disregard the left image, which is just a breakdown by owner, which you know very well, but the right hand, so that's on the left-hand image is an image of the owners of the Tocolan vineyard, historic Tocolan vineyard. And then on the right, though, is a parcel by parcel breakdown of the notable blocks, and you mentioned some of them. So it'd be fun to get your perspective, since this is really one of maybe the most historic vineyard in all of Napa Valley, maybe not necessarily by age, but certainly by reputation. So your wine, you have, because you make two, we're tasting one of your Sauvignon Blancs, but you make two.
Yeah, we made three. We do
Three.
I block, so it's mentioned on your map, I block. We do the Fumé Blanc Reserve, which is close to your monastery block, which is Cabernet Sauvignon. The next one on the upper tiers is the Sauvignon Blanc. Then we have a little piece on the south side, which is the Semillon. And we have T block. You see where is UC Davis reservoir, just east of it, that is T block.
Yeah, that's all the way at the bottom, right?
The Robert blocks, yeah. And they are very located in the best soil for Cabernet Sauvignon, and of course for Sauvignon Blanc. And that's the beauty of Mr. Mondavi. He understood all of that, and he maintained that quality all the time. So his first Fumé Blanc Reserve, well, I think is 1968, but knowing then in 1945, I block was planted, and then T block in 1955. It is a gorgeous story about Tocano and the passion of other varieties than Cabernet Sauvignon.
Yeah, no, that's great. And right by this vineyard is the Oakville Farmhouse, which is one of those field blend vineyards with a lot of different varieties. So it's a really cool little corner. If you get lost a little bit, it's kind of interesting. Jen, I'm wondering, is there any variety that you don't work with that you'd like to?
Ooh, that's a good question. Don't stump me. Oh man, I don't know. You did stump me.
It's my goal. No.
I work with I think the oddest variety that I work with is Trousseau Gris, coming out of Russian River.
Okay.
So I don't know. That's a pretty rare, weird grape. I don't think I could beat that one.
Pretty eccentric. What about the influence of climate change and the varieties grown in the future? Do you think, Geneviève, that there's going to be a big change into how vineyards are replanted, like over the next 20 or 30 years, as climate change becomes a more forceful reality in our daily lives? Or do you think that vineyards like Cabernet Petit Syrah, Zinfandel, that they will just naturally adapt and prosper, in an adaptive way?
I have the feeling that we are very lucky in Napa Valley, because we have a very strong influence of the ocean, and we have so much fog in the morning during harvest. And we are lucky to have very resilient vineyards. The vines is super resilient. So yes, we are going to have a change in climate, but how long it will take, and is it going to be very effective on the way the vines are going to grow? They grow everywhere, those vines. Even in Europe, in the hottest place, you have vineyards. But I really believe in the winemakers are going to be smarter and clever, and they are going to find tricks to tame Mother Nature, which is not easy. But I really believe in the winemakers and the vineyard manager. I believe in young people and the future and their idea of innovations. So that's my understanding.
Well, that's a very positive and optimistic view, which I think is great. There's a question about climate change that's about the degree of increase of temperature, but I think climate change is much more than temperature increases. It's about instability of weather, unpredictability, less rain in the winter. There's a whole factor of, it's not just that summers may be warmer than they used to be, it's that everything is less predictable than it used to be. So it's a pretty complex question that we could spend hours talking about. But I want to ask Bob a question. There's a question here about Zinfandel, because one of the challenges with Zinfandel is that it can soak up in the fermentation tank, right? So you pick it at a certain degree, and you might get a half degree or more just during the winemaking. So how do you, if you know that, how do you deal with it?
The way we've learned how to deal with that is through the sampling process. We can be tasting all these berries, and they're tasting fine and dandy. But it really comes down to really good cluster sampling. And as easy as that may sound, that again, that cluster is only as good and representative of the field as your eye is. It's not as easy as it sounds, but a cluster sample, it at least tries to attempt to bring to us a representative sample of what's really going on. Because, like you say, the reason why it soaks up in the fermenter is that Zinfandel tends to have this tendency, this characteristic, that some of the berries are slightly underripe, some are perfectly ripe, and others are slightly overripe. And depending on where you fall on that, when you pick it, will really dramatically change the outcome of the wine, as we know. So trying to choose the correct cluster that represents what's going on throughout the field is really key. And sometimes growers don't like seeing us carrying out a bucket of grapes, but we try to make it worth their while. And by doing this, it really has allowed us to get a real good handle on really what's going on, so that we can fairly well predict what that ending alcohol is going to be. And we try really hard to keep these within reason, but yet, as we like to say, we're picking at the peak of flavor. We really don't want to have a 12% Zinfandel. That's just not natural, But then on the other hand, we don't want 17% either. That's not natural either. So we try our very best, and for the most part, we succeed. Depending on the vintage, some vintages are a little bit tougher. 17, like you said earlier, that was a little tough. We missed a couple, but that method has really proved to be pretty rock solid. So that's how we deal with it.
You said something that's really interesting. I just want to make sure I understood correctly. So are you saying it's not so much that Zinfandel soaks up in alcohol, but maybe that the reading is often not accurate? And so therefore it's not actually that the fruit chemically is doing something. It's just that you didn't have what you thought you had because the sampling techniques in the past haven't been so accurate. Is that what you're?
Well, sure. Well, yes, in the sense that if one is only sampling turgid berries, firm berries, and bringing those to the winery all throughout the process, and not taking into consideration that the rest of the cluster has, quite maybe 25% of some kind of shrinkage, dehydration going on, which obviously is going to bump the Brix up and thus the alcohol. So if the sampler is only bringing those to the winery, and we're testing those, well, that's going to give us a certain, indication and maybe a false confidence. Oh yeah, we're good. Whereas we could be looking at, 29 to 32 Brix after it all soaks up, and we don't want that. So we want something we want a method that's going to help us determine what we feel fairly confident is going to come in. It is one of the challenges with this variety, without a doubt. I mean, like Petit Syrah generally doesn't have that challenge.
Yeah.
So it's a little easier.
That's fascinating. Thank you. Tim, I have a question for you. You make a lot of different wines, a lot of different single vineyard wines. So since we have a Pinot Noir here, I'm just curious, is your view to try to make each of these wines more or less the same way, with the idea that you really want the expression of the site? Or do you think each site is so unique that it really needs a tailored approach to vinification, aging, choice of coopers, et cetera? I mean, what governs your kind of philosophy to winemaking?
I mean, I think ultimately it's trying to find the balance between the vintage, the place, our belief in what Pinot Noir and Chardonnay can be, and then, ultimately the grape. So it is a case by case basis. I wouldn't say that we stray too far away from a normal approach or what we consider a standard approach. But yeah, we learned that some sites are more inherently open to more whole cluster fermentation, and Some sites like to be picked earlier and some sites like to be picked later. The goal for me is always to have those four real components in balance and in creating some form of tension that ultimately carries the life of the fruit in the wine itself. So yeah, I think it really is a case by case, site by site basis that we try to elucidate what we think is the purest expression, without being too heavy handed that, you know, we can't sort of see the vineyard and the vintage and the grapes purity. So I think that's generally our approach, is try to explore every vintage and not be too didactic, and see what the site and the vintage allows us to make.
Well, thanks, Tim. I think that's a perfect segue into your auction lot, which consists of 27 magnums. From what I remember, a part of the Sainsbury Library was damaged by fire some years ago. Am I misremembering?
No, that's correct. We had a very large fire, and we have very few old vintages. Certain vintages are completely gone. But the wines that we choose to age, typically we keep in magnum. And I'm really excited about this auction lot because it shows a pretty beautiful just array of what Carneros can be. So I think I'm excited for whoever lands the winning bid.
I think whoever lands the winning bid should be really excited. 27 magnums plus a virtual tasting with you, and it's 3 bottles of each. So because what you've done is you have 3 vineyards. So in this lot, so there's 3 bottles of each vintage from 2009 to 2012 from Brown Ranch. Then you have 3 bottles of each vintage from 2013 to 2015 from the Lee Vineyard, and then 3 bottles of each vintage from 04 and 15s from the Stanley Ranch, which is another highly regarded site. And so those are 3 Carneros sites, and a lot of wine to explore the development of these vintages over many, many years to come. So that's just an incredible collection of wines, and especially considering how rare they must be. I can't even imagine. So what a lot. And then Jen, let's look at yours. You have 10 magnums spanning 10 years, plus a virtual tasting with you. And it's a magnum in each vintage from 2008 through 2017 of the red blend. Has that wine changed a lot over the years, or has it been the blend of sites that you talked about at the beginning?
It's primarily the blend of sites. So the cornerstone of every single wine in that flight is the Cabernet Franc from Coombsville. And then we also have been working with the same Merlot source, and for the most part, the same Cabernet source. There's been a couple years where we might have changed out a Cabernet source just because one vineyard lot might have worked better with the blend than another one. So that's one of the beauties of a blend, is the ability to use what we have to make the very best blend that we can possibly do to accentuate that Cabernet Franc from the estate vineyard. So this is the entire lifespan of Arrow&Branch wines from the 2008, which wasn't originally commercially available. They held that one back because it was such a small amount. And then with the 2009, they became a commercial product, commercial wine. So, yeah.
So 10 magnums, 10 years, and a virtual tasting with you. That's a fantastic lot. Great. And then the Robert Yali lot, which you have creatively called Zinfandelicious, which is a great name. I might have to steal that for something. 12 magnums and a virtual tasting with you and your winemaker Tresgetting. And you have, there's a question before, we have so many questions, it's hard to get to all of them. There's a question of why do you make so many different single vineyard wines, and are they all that different? And as I look at these vineyard, I know the answer when I look at this lot, which is a bottle of each vintage. So you've got the Moore Vineyard in Coombsville, 2009 through 2011. You have Stagecoach, 2010 through 2012. Black Chicken, which is in Napa Valley, 2011 through 2013. And then Petit Syrah from 2006 through 2008. So tell us, why do you make so many different wines?
Because it's our mission to showcase these sites and to really honor each in particular vineyard, I mean, we could make one big pot of Zen. It wouldn't really be wouldn't be our style. It wouldn't be as fun. But it is. I tell you, it is one reason why we try to keep all these things in balance. And you know, we only use like 25% new oak, and it's French oak, which is a little bit more delicate, as we know, because we really want to honor the site. You know, because otherwise they will all taste together. I mean, they will all taste the same, and that's no fun either. You know, we really want to showcase the site and honor the grower and the history of these sites. A little interesting thing here on this lot is what the Black Chicken is our home lot. I mean, our home ranch and whatnot. It's the old code word for my dad's homemade wine he was selling on a party line phone system. He started that when he was 14 years old. Did it for 30 years at least. Anyway, the R.W. Moore, that's in Coombsville, and that's a cooler district. And that was planted in 1905, and that really is a beautiful expression of that district. And it's not as cool as people may imagine. Definitely cooler than Oakville. However, it's a beautiful region, and again, it's a field blend. The Stagecoach is the only Zinfandel we have at the moment that is purely Zinfandel. And so while everything else is a field blend, this one is a younger vineyard. You know, it's up there on the Eastern Hills, and younger in the sense that it's not, 85 years old. And so it's a great pure expression of Stagecoach. And of course, Petit Syrah, most of that is from the Gamble Ranch there in Rutherford. It's just stunning. It's happier than a clam there. It's, Petit Syrah can be a little aggressive. This one is definitely not. Tress really, really knows how to handle tannins, and it's really a silk glove. Part of that is sight, and part of that is just the way he handles it. So we're really excited about this, and it showcases how well I think Zen and Petit will age as well. So there you go.
So thank you, Bob. That was a fantastic summary. And then Geneviève, just to wrap up with the Robert Mondavi lot, I think only you could put together a lot like this. 12 bottles of 1995 of the Cabernet Sauvignon Reserve, Oakville, and 12 bottles of the Fumé Blanc Reserve from Tokalan also. And your lot doesn't include a virtual tasting with you, but I bet if somebody asked, they could get it, right?
Absolutely.
Excellent.
I will enjoy that. I will have fun.
Why 1995? You could have chosen any vintage.
It's a gorgeous vintage, 1995. And I think it's important to showcase beautiful Napa Valley. And we have so many gorgeous vintages, and all different, because all the vintages have been good, but the expression of the vines in every vintage is different. And so what we are trying to showcase here is the 95 vintage and beautiful the Tokalan vineyard and beautiful expression of Tokalan in two varieties. We like to call our Fumé Blanc the white wine of Tokalan. Just like in Bordeaux, you have the white, in the Grave, you have the white and the red. So we have to forget that this is a Sauvignon Blanc, but it's a beautiful white wine of Tokalan. And this is gorgeous.
Well, you can call it the white Musigny, just like the Vogue, but if you do that, I want a royalty because it's a really great idea.
Okay, we'll work together.
Great. Well, wow, what this has been so much fun. I just want to thank our four panelists for sharing your insights. I think we could have had, instead of an hour discussion, we could have had easily 4-hour discussion. So thanks to all of our panelists, Tim Colla, Jen Williams, Robert Yali, Geneviève Jensen. Thanks for being with us. I want to thank our audience for being with us this afternoon, and it's phenomenal questions. I wish we could get to all of them, but it's tough to get to all of them. But thank you so much for your fantastic questions. I also want to thank the Napa Valley Vintners for hosting Napa Valley sessions and organizing this. Zacky's for running the auction. As a reminder, all of these seminars are available both on YouTube. You can also find them on the Vinous site under our multimedia. We've got them all posted there. Just as a reminder, there's about a day and 18 hours left to bid on these lots. And the success of this auction is really critical. in terms of a number of initiatives that are actively moving forward to promote and support the Napa Valley. So please bid generously. The live bidding starts at 3 p.m. on Saturday. And I think it's a wrap for today. So this is the 5th of the Napa Valley sessions. It's been really fun. Thanks to everybody for joining. And I hope we get a chance to do this again soon. Cheers.
All right. Thank you, Antonio.
Cheers. Thank you all.
Cheers.